What would you do if someone walked up to you tomorrow and told you that President Donald Trump is going to be assassinated in 2 weeks? And instead of being vague about it, they went into detail. President Donald Trump will be shot twice. The first bullet will be through his left leg, and the second will be through his heart, killing him on the spot. Wouldn't you just look at this person and call them crazy? I know, I sure would. Unless this guy was a CIA agent of some kind, there would be nothing he could say to get me on board. And I'm sure that's how you would feel about that situation too. This wacko's prediction is just too specific and it'll never happen that way, even if the assassination takes place. But what if it did? And he was right about every single detail of the event, even down to the specifics of where the bullets entered the body. Wouldn't you listen to whatever crazy predictions he made after that and take it almost as fact? Especially if these new predictions turned out to be true as well. It would be crazy to have someone like that around, wouldn't it? I sure know who I'd be asking for lottery numbers. Unfortunately, there aren't many people who have ever tapped into this fortune teller ability. The overwhelming majority end up being frauds, the ones who are right, and not just right once, like consistently right. They get remembered for a very long time, way longer than if they had been otherwise regular people. There's something about this predicting the future skill that fascinates most people. Just think of Grigory Rasputin. He was a very mediocre person. If not for his ability to predict the future, he'd have been forgotten just like every other Russian peasant from that time period. Another great example is a plague doctor who was born in southern France in the 1500s. His birth name was Michel de Nostradamus. You've probably heard of him as Nostradamus. Later in life, he got his name Latinized as if to add a bit more credibility to himself, although he didn't need very much, because his predictions consistently came true. And so many came true that he won over the attention of the French royal family. Remember that Trump assassination prediction we were talking about earlier? This guy was making predictions like that in his own day. And here's the scary part. He was getting at least most of them right. A little disclaimer here though. This episode will not be dealing with these predictions specifically, whether or not they came true or anything like that. We will simply be looking into his life because I think it's very overshadowed. People are more interested in seeing how he predicted 9/11 and the Great Fire of London, and they overlook this very fascinating tale of a man who, let's just say, suffered through the extremes of the human experience in a couple of ways. If you'd like something dealing more on the prediction side of Nostradamus, I will be having a series on my YouTube channel you can check out. Link to that will be in the show notes. Now there's one story in particular from Nostradamus' life that caught my attention and really was the inspiration for this entire podcast episode. The story goes something like this. So one day Nostradamus is walking past a group of low clergymen. These were not bishops or cardinals or anything important. These were just very average, mediocre clergymen. And Nostradamus knelt before one in particular, not the entire group, just one man. And he referred to this one man as His Majesty. When they asked Nostradamus why he did it, he responded with something to the effect of he was paying his homage and respect to a man of great holiness. It's really not all that impressive until you find out that this one friar went on to become the Pope. Pope Sixtus V. And there are a million other little stories just like that one that make Nostradamus a very fascinating figure. So, without any further ado, the life of Nostradamus. The man who would go on to become the infamous Nostradamus was born in December of 1503. Now, before we get into Nostradamus' childhood, we need to understand where his family came from. Nostradamus' family was officially Catholic, but they weren't actually Catholic. You see, Nostradamus' grandparents had actually been Jewish, and they were forced to convert to Catholicism unless they wanted to be kicked out of the country. For those of you that know a little bit about medieval Europe, it was commonplace for Jews and other minority groups to be kicked out of a country if they got too much power. And a lot of times, if you had a decent king, they offered these people an opportunity to convert to the popular religion, which was Catholicism. So Nostradamus' grandparents on both sides renounced Judaism and embraced and converted to Catholicism, at least publicly. Now, behind closed doors, it was a very different story. They did everything they could to keep their religion and their traditions alive, which is important to understand because the two grandfathers that converted to Catholicism but kept their religion alive, these were the same men that educated the young Nostradamus. They were very involved in just about every aspect of his early childhood. They taught him about the Kabbalah and Jewish traditions and astronomy and philosophy and a whole bunch of other esoteric practices that the average person wasn't too familiar with. This, of course, gave Nostradamus a big leg up when he went to regular school like all the other kids. He knew a lot more than a lot of the people that were his age. So his childhood was primarily spent being educated by his two grandfathers very thoroughly, I might add, and he didn't really have to worry about much in the world because his father was a very successful merchant. They weren't necessarily rich or anything, but you could call them upper middle class during a time when there really was no upper middle class, so that's a little interesting in and of itself. Now, when Nostradamus went to the equivalent of high school during medieval times, he grew a fondness for the Copernican model of the Earth, which sparked a little bit of outrage. Now, for those of you that know a little bit about medieval Europe, you'll know that they viewed the Earth as a flat, motionless plane. They had a very archaic worldview, and the way the Earth was described in the Bible was the way they thought it was. And this was right around the time that people started getting this idea of this spinning ball Earth, and that little intellectual contagion started going around and making its waves, and it eventually found its way to Nostradamus. And he got in trouble because he became a defender of this model of the Earth, which was a very bad thing to be during this time, because if you were deemed a heretic, well, let's just say it could be bad for your health. He was smart enough to avoid any serious trouble for these beliefs that he held, but it developed the big theme of his life, hiding his knowledge. This was the point in his life when he learned that if he was too open about the things that he knew and believed and he thought about, that he could be deemed an enemy of the state and killed for it. So as a result, he was much more secretive. Now, despite having to hide his knowledge, he still thought it was a good idea to go to university, and he went to the University of Avignon. We don't know much about what happened when he was there. We only know that he was there for less than a year, and the reason he left was actually because of the plague. The Black Death that had been decimating Europe for hundreds of years eventually made its way to this town that hosted the University of Avignon and forced Nostradamus to leave. We don't have very many records about Nostradamus' life before he got semi-famous, but this early experience with the plague may very well have been the spark that got him to pursue being a plague doctor as a full-time job, because when he left university, he went out on his own. According to his own account, Nostradamus spent these next 8 years studying apothecary on his own, out and about, and he really didn't have any formal business or medical teachings or anything like that. There wasn't a whole lot of emphasis on authority during this time, so he was basically a freelance doctor. A freelance doctor during maybe one of the worst epidemics in European history. And as I was reading about his life, I seriously wondered if Nostradamus learned more on his own as opposed to the formal route in school. Because we all know that just because you sit in a classroom doesn't necessarily mean you learn anything. There were a lot of people going to a lot of universities trying to become the next best plague doctor to save the human race, but a lot of them just weren't successful. Nostradamus, however, was. And something he did during this 8-year stretch of time is he invented a pill. It was called the rose pill. And it was basically herbs and medicine and all this other stuff smashed into one little pill, and people would keep it in their mouth, and it was said to prevent and cure the plague. Now, Nostradamus may not have known everything about the human body and how disease works, but he was very successful because he garnered a very good reputation as a plague doctor. Now, there's also a couple things that he did that were somewhat revolutionary that he just doesn't get credit for that should be noted. For example, he was one of the few plague doctors of medieval Europe to have a vague understanding of germs and bacteria. Now, if someone with the plague just used a spoon, Nostradamus would probably have been the guy that would advise you to not use it for your morning cereal. And this sounds like common sense to us now in the 21st century, but you have to remember, this was a time when someone would get the plague and they would go to a town where no one had the plague so they could catch the health. It was a very dark time for human science and ingenuity, but that did not stop people like Nostradamus. There isn't a whole lot else that happened during this time period that we really know anything about. Now, we can speculate. Maybe he had a family that he never talked about. Maybe he killed someone or lived some life or traveled some places. We just don't really know. We only really have his account of this time, and that account states that he was basically a freelance apothecary. But for some reason, that just wasn't cutting it out for him, because he re-entered schooling in 1529 to get his doctorate in medicine. Just like the first time he went to university, Nostradamus would not be able to finish this degree, but this time it was not because of a plague outbreak, it was because he was expelled. And the reason they expelled him was because he was part of a manual trade. Now, this is going to be a little weird for us 21st century people to really get our heads around, because this is a time in history when working with your hands, that was seen as a bad thing. If you touched money, it was viewed as a bad thing. If you were a day laborer, that was viewed as a bad thing. The goal in life was to become an aristocratic elite where you didn't have to do anything, and you were basically just served. Right? This is still feudal Europe, and the big goal in life was to have people working your land that were basically your slaves. And part of that stigma attached itself to the medical field. Now, because Nostradamus, instead of going to a university and getting a big fancy degree, he actually went into his field and practiced on his own. And that is why he was kicked out of this university. It was seen as a very taboo thing to do, and it didn't matter that this may very well have been the thing that gave him an edge as a plague doctor. There were a lot of people that tried to become plague doctors that sucked and that they made it even worse. Not Nostradamus. But it doesn't matter if he was a better plague doctor as a result. It was a manual trade, and he wasn't going to be becoming a doctor at this university. So he just continued doing what he always did, and he went back to apothecary and practicing as a doctor on his own. Now, his reputation had been steadily growing. He was known as the guy that invented the rose pill. Now, unfortunately, he couldn't patent it or anything like that, and it may very well have just been a straight-up placebo. He may not have actually helped these people with his rose pill, but people thought they were being helped by it. And that is the important thing. Nostradamus would eventually luck out with this reputation because he was invited to live in another part of France with someone that would become one of his close friends. Now, the guy that invited him was a very educated, aristocratic, elite kind of guy. Now, for my medieval European enthusiasts out there, this guy was a number 2 to Erasmus, the great Christian theologian and thinker, and he did a whole bunch of other stuff. But this was basically the second most educated man of European medieval times. So Nostradamus moved, became friends with Scaliger, this high upper-class person, eventually found a wife in this town, and he had 2 kids. His reputation as a wonderful plague doctor continued. He made plenty of money, he had the family, he had the friends, he had everything that someone could ever want. He was at the peak of his life. But things took a turn for the worse just a couple years later, because his wife and his family died of the very disease that he spent his entire life fighting. His family died of the plague. And this was even worse for him because people doubted his ability to fight the plague because his family died. There's a dentist in my town who got himself a reputation as someone who occasionally breaks jawbones during dental procedures. This has only happened once or twice, but the important thing is the people whose jaws were broken were very popular and very chatty. And a broken jawbone doesn't necessarily mean the dentist is bad. Sometimes that's just a risk of the operation. It's just going to happen to some people. When it comes to the human body, there is always the factor of random, even in the 21st century. So, to this doctor's detriment, rumors spread all over town, and now his business is drying up. Who on earth wants to go pay money to someone that might not know what they're doing? It doesn't matter that he did everything right and everything by the books. He didn't use the wrong tool or anything. But what is happening? He is losing everything because the wrong thing happened at the wrong time to the wrong person. And now, people doubt his ability to fix their teeth and go through any of these procedures. And the same thing that happened to this dentist happened to Nostradamus. People doubted his ability to fight the plague. After all, he let it kill his own family. How the heck is he going to save your family if he can't even save his own? Business dried up quickly. Nostradamus was left with essentially nothing, but it gets even worse than that. Nostradamus' friend, who had originally invited him out to this French town, they had a disagreement and they stopped communicating. And this was Nostradamus' only real friend. And here is the icing on the cake. Now, after his family died, business dried up, and he had a falling out with his only real friend. He had to spend these next couple years fighting his wife's family. When you got married in medieval Europe, the family of the wife would provide a gift to the husband. This was called a dowry. Now, this could come in a number of different things. It could be horses or cattle or land. In Nostradamus' case, it was money. And remember, Nostradamus' business was completely dried up. He was basically broke, and he did not have the means to return this money to his wife's family. And just when you think that things cannot get any worse, it does. Because the Inquisition was after him. Now, 3 years before all of this happened, he made a joke at the expense of a sculptor who was working on a statue of Mary. There are a lot of people who cannot take any criticism, especially when it's not an attempt to be constructive, right? If someone just says, "You suck," that is the worst thing ever that someone can say to you, right? And that's how this man felt when Nostradamus was joking about how horrible his statue was. Now, because this statue was of the Virgin Mary, he remembered it and reported Nostradamus to the authorities years later, claiming that he was a heretic. Nostradamus was not trying to disrespect the Virgin Mary. He was not anti-Christian. It was just that this guy really had it out for Nostradamus, and he was going to get him back the best way you could get someone back during this time, and that was to have them attacked by the church authorities. Nostradamus was ordered to stand trial, which could have entailed physical torture. Like any smart person would have done, Nostradamus fled for his life, and he began traveling across Europe. He no longer had a reason to stay. He had no family, he had no friends, no money. His reputation as a great plague doctor vanished into the wind. There was nothing holding him to this land, so he just went out and explored the world. It's during this time of great tragedy and great tribulation that Nostradamus is said to have developed his prophetic powers. It's actually very difficult to understand Nostradamus' thought process and how his prophetic visions played into his worldview. I spent a very long time trying to figure out a good way to put it, but the best thing I could come up with was a quote from one of Nostradamus' favorite philosophers, a man by the name of Meister Eckhart. This is one of his quotes that I think sums up the way Nostradamus felt about his prophecies. Quote, "The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love." And it's a really interesting way to look at the world, especially because a lot of these very educated, highly intellectual people think that's how the world actually is. Right? When Nostradamus believes this stuff, now don't get me wrong, this is still medieval times, they're somewhat superstitious compared to us today, but he's still a very educated man for his own time period, and this is what he actually believes. One thing that you have to do with Nostradamus is look about how he went to bringing these prophecies to the world. And he didn't necessarily go the get-rich-quick route, which is how most people would have done it. As I mentioned in the beginning of this show, there's a lot of people throughout history who claim to be able to predict the future and predict, your personality, what your job is or is going to be, all these other things, and they really just try to do it to make money, even though they don't really have any psychic abilities at all. Nostradamus was different though, because instead of making it obvious where he would be given credit for predicting this or that, he dressed his prophecies for the future, he dressed it up in very complex language with weird references and obscure meanings and different interpretations. And what he did was he published all these prophecies in a book called The Prophecies. They were organized in chapters, but he called them centuries. And he wrote the entire thing in something called a quatrain, which was basically 4 lines of poetry. It was primarily written in French. However, he did not hesitate to use other languages in his book. There were certain sections that were written in Greek and in Latin and Italian and a couple other different languages. He really went the extra mile to make it very difficult to really understand what it is that he was saying. You could realistically become an expert on Nostradamus and do nothing but read and interpret, and even if you learn all these different languages to be able to understand what he was saying in the language he wrote them in, and you could go through all this and still not really have a clue of what he's saying. Now it's important to note why it is that he wrote this book this way, and it was because he did not want to become a suspect of the church. He had already escaped the wrath of the Inquisition once, and if he started making prophecies of the future, especially if those prophecies held the church up in a negative light, that could have been bad for him, so he was not about to get risky with it anytime soon. So he dressed it up in very obscure languages, and it was only the upper class that could really understand what it is that he was saying. Now imagine being in the 1500s without Google Translate, and you have a book in front of you that has passages that sometimes come from 4 different languages. How do you interpret that? How do you read that? And that's on top of all the obscure meanings and references, and you really had to be a highly, highly educated person to be able to understand what the heck he was talking about, and I cannot stress that enough. But he did not go completely bonkers. He still practiced medicine and apothecary and still did everything he could to help people and protect them from the plague. That was really his calling in life. This prophecy, future seer was only an afterthought, really. He actually received a lifetime pension from a town in France after he saved basically the entire town. He worked nonstop for around 6 years, and they gave him a lifetime pension, which was very generous. But he did actually save a lot of lives. And the entire town may very well have died out had he not done what he did. So by the time he was in his late adulthood, he was pretty much chilling out. He found himself a nice, wealthy widow. Her name was Anna Pozart Gamel. We don't really know that much about her. She was good for him. He still was a man. Men need women. That's how the world works. And he settled down. He did have a nice, quiet life. And he did this doctor stuff. He got himself a new wife. And he started publishing almanacs. And really his free time was spent doing this prediction and prophecy stuff. It was kind of the passion project that took over his life after a certain point. Now things were going pretty good for Nostradamus at this point. He was building his reputation back up. He had a thriving business as a plague doctor again. And people were very interested in what he was writing, these prophecies for the future. Right? Someone saves your life, with this plague doctor stuff, this rose pill. And then the next thing you know, you find out that they're prophesizing the future. You're going to be interested in what that person has to say. Now, unfortunately for Nostradamus, this resulted in a lot of peasants and lower class people despising him because they could not understand a word of anything he said. Now, I stressed very strongly how educated you had to be to understand what the heck he was prophesizing in these books. Now, imagine being on a first grade reading level or worse and trying to read that and take any kind of information from it. It was basically impossible. The peasants began thinking of Nostradamus as some crazy guy, and he wrote all this cryptic babble. That's what they thought he did with his free time. It was a bunch of hocus pocus as far as the average folk was concerned. There was a group of people who received Nostradamus' work very well, though, and that would be the nobility. And this is primarily why Nostradamus is remembered today. Now, in medieval times, it's important to understand that you cannot just print 1 million copies of your book and send them out worldwide. Right, today we can go on Amazon and you can write a book, make it an ebook, and every single person on earth can theoretically go and read your ebook, like if you put it up for free or whatever. It wasn't like that during this time. The average person could barely read if they could at all. And on top of that, the printing press was only just coming around. So every single thing that you read had to be written by hand, which makes things infinitely more difficult as a writer. So what do you do in a time period like this if you want your work to be remembered and have some kind of influence on the world? You write for the nobility. Because if royalty is reading what you write, even if they don't necessarily agree with you or adopt your beliefs or thoughts or anything like that, if they're just reading it, you have some kind of real-world impact. Let's say you went out in the 1500s and you wrote something that everyone could understand and everyone really liked. So what? You got a bunch of peasants to read your book. That would be the medieval equivalent of having your meme go viral on Twitter. Sure, it feels good, it feels great, but it doesn't really do anything for you because, so what? A bunch of people saw what you made. It doesn't mean anything changes. So Nostradamus dressed up his beliefs and his predictions of the future in this very complicated language. And one of the most important people to read the prophecies was Catherine de Medici, who was the wife of King Henry II of France. And she got very worried after she started reading Nostradamus because there were a few quatrains that she thought applied to her husband, and they implied that he would be dying on his 41st birthday. Catherine de' Medici believed that her husband, King Henry II of France, was going to die because of Nostradamus' prediction. And it must have scared her to death when her husband actually did die, and in a way that you could really make an argument that Nostradamus had seen it coming. This one prophecy is what made Nostradamus famous, because this got him in with the royal family, and he just went on making these predictions and prophecies of the future. Some of them were hit and miss, but this one is the one that most people believe came true. It went a little something like this, quote, "The young lion will overcome the older one on the fields of combat in a single battle. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage, 2 wounds made 1. Then he dies a cruel death." Now this is the way many people, including Catherine de' Medici, interpreted this quatrain. The young lion is a man by the name of Gabriel Montgomery, who had been jousting with King Henry II of France. So this is how it happened. King Henry II was jousting with a captain of the King's Scottish Guard by the name of Gabriel Montgomery. Now Montgomery's lance broke and it split in 2 pieces, and when they jousted it went through Henry's helmet. One piece entered Henry's throat and the other through his eye. After a few days of what I can only imagine to be excruciating agony, he died of an infection that was the result of the injury. This young lion is Gabriel Montgomery, who overcomes the older one, who is King Henry II of France. It all happened on a field of combat in a single battle. He pierced his eye through his helmet, which should not have let the lance in to begin with, but that was broken as well. The 2 wounds made 1, then he dies a cruel death. The 2 wounds was the pierce through the eye and through the neck, which eventually became 1. And I'm sure you can see why people started taking Nostradamus' predictions a little bit more seriously after that. Remember that Trump assassination prediction we had discussed in the beginning of the episode? This was the medieval equivalent of that, and Nostradamus was the man who made that prediction. Catherine de' Medici became obsessed with Nostradamus, and here's where the parallel with Rasputin really comes in, because both of these men, they practiced their religion in a bit of a weird way. They both had an interesting relationship with the wife of a Catholic monarch, and they both are famous today because they made predictions of the future that came true. Many people in modern times have dismissed Nostradamus as a kook, and the people that believe in his predictions to be nut jobs. While there is some truth to sentiment like that, the people that lived with Nostradamus during his own time, they believed what he said. Catherine de' Medici did not throw him out after he made one lucky guess. Nostradamus stayed around and made more predictions. He predicted who would become the Pope, who would become the king, who would die an early death. And more times than not, he was right. But again, this was only his side job. He was still primarily a doctor, and he became a physician for royalty, which was pretty much how he spent most of his days after this point. And this is really Nostradamus's happily ever after, becoming a doctor and a future seer for nobility. He was essentially part of the royal entourage for the rest of his life, and that's really where it ends. And it's really interesting to think about because he was a very formidable man. This was someone who had lived during the Inquisition, who had the church after him for being a heretic. He did not die of the plague despite being a plague doctor. Oftentimes that's how you died as a plague doctor, always being in contact with people that had this horrible illness. And let's not forget the horrible tragedies that he suffered when his family died. The fact that he did not take his own life is a little admirable in and of itself. He died at the age of 62, having accomplished just about everything he wanted to in his life, leaving behind a very controversial legacy and a book that will inspire many heated debates for the foreseeable future. And that, my friends, was the life of Nostradamus. I hope you all enjoyed the show. If you'd like more content on Nostradamus, you can check out the series on my YouTube channel, which, if it's not out by the time of this episode, will be out soon. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter at Eric Alden. And that is going to be all. Until next time, my friends.